Hi, everyone. That Joni Mitchell, hey, she makes it sound so fun, paving paradise. I feel guilty that she puts a smile on my face, especially after the total seriousness of the last session. It's very hard to disagree on collective responsibility for modern slavery. I think it may be less hard to disagree, and there may be more disagreement, therefore, on the subject of this session. Is carbon offsetting a license for big companies to pollute? Just a few sort of contextual data points, some of them deriving from our own mining at Tortoise, which makes us an extractive company in a way. So the Responsibility 100 Index tells us that 68 out of 100 FTSE 100 companies have net zero targets. We're going to learn more about the weeds beneath those kinds of figures in the Climate 100 Index, which comes out next week. We already know that COP is 18 days away. Many people frantically lowering expectations already. It is dominated, the discourse of the issues being debated at COP have been dominated since Paris, since 2015, by the concept of net zero, the goal of net zero. And in principle, to achieve net zero, you reduce your emissions first, and any residual ones you then consider offsetting. So one of the questions that I hope we can address today is whether, in fact, too much is happening the other way around, where the offsetting comes first and the reduction comes later. There are many different aspects to this question. Do offsets work? How are they certified? Are they real? And what's better for the planet? Offsets that focus on reduction or offsets that focus on carbon removal? We've got some great invited speakers, and I'll come to them in a second. I'll give you an abbreviated version of our housekeeping because we've got less than 50 minutes now. Of course, the main point is please, everyone, dive in the chat, raise your hands. And even though the title is concerns big companies, tell us about your experience of offsetting. If anyone's been flying again recently, have you paid to offset? If you've been on EasyJet, I think you'll find that they claim to have done your offsetting in advance for you. Do you believe them? How does that make you feel? But look, let's dive straight in. And I'd like, if possible, in a sense, in my mind, to start in the middle with Maria Carvalho, who is a senior consultant at South Pole. And Maria, I've been looking at your website a bit. You, if I have it right, South Pole runs carbon reduction projects to turn climate action into business opportunities. There are some amazing numbers, and feel free to address them if you like. $700 million under management, $10 billion in private capital mobilized, and 80 million tons of CO2 or CO2 equivalent saved over the past 10 years. But I just sort of, I only really invite you to address all that in passing if it's relevant. I want actually to start by referring to a chat that we had on the phone yesterday, in which you said that carbon offsetting should be a third resort, not a first resort, and it should be required, not voluntary. Could you, well, maybe I can see you, maybe I haven't got that quite, but can you explain what you actually meant in case I've misrepresented you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Giles, and thanks also for inviting me to a really interesting discussion with a very thought-provoking question. First, just to clarify, South Pole did actually start off as a project developer. So we did start in, the main ethos of the company is to figure out ways to take climate action for everyone. And the first one was actually figuring out a financial mechanism that would go into projects. But the company has actually gone from climate projects to working with clients on how they set science-based targets, how they create their reduction plan so that offsets are your third resort. But the first one, so in going with, and then the third thing that we do is also to figure out ways to aggregate impact financing. So that's through climate investments, and we also do a lot of digital solutions. So that's just to say that what started out as a company in 2006 has vastly expanded in order to enable climate action that actually has high integrity. And for us, high integrity is actually pushing companies. Actually, the first resort is exactly what was said in the chat, is what we do is both in terms of voluntary, but also increasingly what we hope is compliance. And the first resort should always be, we should be making governments push towards stronger carbon pricing. Right now, only 21% of global emissions is under a carbon price. 3% of that emissions is to a carbon price rate that actually is in the lower bound of what it needs to be, like really low rates, not enough to move the dial on when we get serious on it. So the first resort actually is pushing governments to actually put strong carbon pricing in place that penalizes fossil fuels and fossil fuel consumption. When you do that, it means that you're not having just a disparate set of actions that different companies can take and then communicate on. What you need is every single unit of pollution that's out there in the world to have a price, because then that shifts behavior, that shifts investment, and that price has to be high enough so that you actually incentivize and penalize pushing off coal. We've talked about this yesterday, where when the UK actually put in a carbon price, a stronger carbon price for their power sector in 2013, within 4 years, it managed to halve its carbon intensity. And the main reason for that is it pushed coal off the system. Coal was 40% of generation and went down to 9%. And that was the fastest any power sector has reduced its carbon intensity. So this is the importance of carbon pricing. It's the importance of pushing governments to put a strong carbon price, but then to think about how to use the revenues, not only for low carbon transitions, but to be progressive, to not hurt communities and households that would be affected by a stronger carbon price. So that's first resort. Second resort is really pushing companies. And that's why we're really welcoming things like the Science-Based Target Initiative and even the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. The key here is setting ambitious targets that cover all scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. So what we mean by that is directly from your facilities, those from your energy and heating supply, and then your investments, your suppliers, like really thinking comprehensively about where emissions are coming from your decisions, and then figuring out what are the mitigation options to reduce those emissions. Once that is done in such a way that you can really say that a company or any entity is addressing all their emissions that they can in a given period of time, then yes, you should think about if it's not being taxed. So this is what my caveat was for you, was that if it's not being taxed and there's already not a price in place, then by governments pushing you to actually penalize for your fossil fuel for any of your emissions, then it's fair to say in some way you should be addressing that impact. And carbon credits in that way, when it's certified to the highest standards, actually can create faster climate action because it goes towards those projects that can realize emission reductions in the immediate term, in the short to medium term.
Maria, thank you. And you just mentioned the certification word, and that's something that I want to ask Sarah about in just a second. But for those of us who aren't economists, can you just explain in really simple language, what is the effect on offsetting of a higher price? It presumably incentivizes offsetting for some.
No, I mean, so I think there's the carbon price, which is a price you put on actual fossil fuel emissions. So it would be what you would see in a fossil fuel, like at the pump, or so that's one thing that governments can impose. And when it's a higher price, then you can see that suddenly the fuel that has a lower carbon entity or even renewables won't have any effect on your total energy price. If you were already buying renewables, it suddenly becomes a lot cheaper in that kind of decision making. So there's the carbon price that governments put on. Now, what you're talking about is the carbon credit price. So if you're seeing in the market, in the voluntary carbon market or in the compliance markets, a strong carbon price just means that you make decisions on that. Like if it's carbon credits, it just then means, should I if it's cheaper then for you to reduce your emissions than to pay a much higher carbon credit price, it creates a real incentive for you to rethink and double back on your reduction plan and say, why should I pay someone else to reduce their emissions when I should be reducing mine? So that's the importance of a much stronger carbon credit price as we see. And we're seeing that with our clients asking, the prices are going up. And we're like, great. That means either you look back on your reduction and say, now it's more cost effective for me to reduce, or on the other hand, it's still too expensive for me to reduce on these kinds of things. For that, I'll compensate by going into even more ambitious projects that can really move the dial on climate action.
That's brilliant. I feel slightly embarrassed, but I'm also really pleased that I asked the question, because that distinction between the carbon price and the carbon credit price is clearly vital. And I always thought that when we were talking about the carbon price, we were implicitly talking about the carbon credit price, but they're in inverse, aren't they? I mean, if the carbon price goes up to say $80, then if you're in the business of offsetting or CCS, for example, you can charge people $80 a ton to bury the stuff, right?
So, I mean, it goes to that, right? So every project will send out what the price that they're willing to sell at. And you as the buyer have to think about at that selling price, if I want to buy a CCUS credit, is it so expensive? And so some of these are going at $100 per ton. That's much higher than even governments are putting it. Many governments are putting their carbon price. Now that's assuming that you're facing that carbon price from governments. If you're not, and you're thinking, I want to buy a CCUS credit, but it's at $100 a ton, you're either making that choice because you really want to support CCUS and have that technology scale. And so that's your way of doing it in a way that is you're determining impact. Or you say, actually, it's cheaper for me to, at $100 a ton, it's cheaper for me to create energy efficiencies, to switch fuel supplies, so you don't need that. So that's the kind of decision making companies should be making with regards to seeing carbon credit prices go up. But really what I'm really hoping for is governments themselves put a very strong carbon price signal. So we're no longer talking about voluntary markets here or voluntary action. It really should be compliance. And that's really where the conversation should be moving. How do we push governments to take much stronger climate policy signals, carbon pricing being a very strong one towards fossil fuel emissions?
Understood. Okay, thank you so much. Can I come to Sarah Leugers, please, who's Head of Communications at Gold Standard? And Sarah, certification is, as I understand it, your core business. And I take Maria's point about where the conversation should be. But like it or not, the conversation right now is about offsetting. And the slides at the top showed, among other things, that in the voluntary offsetting market, demand is surging. So it is surely more important than ever that we know, that companies know, that when they purchase offsets, that actually means something. Can you explain, just as a starter, how you offer that assurance?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll first, if you don't mind, echo Maria's point 100%. Gold standard shouldn't have to exist. I mean, if there was government will for a carbon price across the economy, gold standard doesn't need to exist, but we do. And so how we work and provide that assurance is in a number of ways. And we actually look at it in two dimensions. We have, a gold standard really believes that climate action and sustainable development should be two sides of the same coin, and we shouldn't look at one in the absence of the other. But on the climate side, the reason that consumers or business can trust that that impact is real is that projects have to follow a set of requirements, setting their baseline, which is what happens before the project, and follow a methodology that's approved by our independent, in our case, an independent technical advisory committee, to calculate the emission reductions or the sequestration, the carbon removal that happens from that baseline to the project scenario. So what is achieved in a given monitoring period. And those calculations are verified by an independent third party. And that happens in two cycles. First at the project design, to make sure the project's properly set up in order to deliver successfully. And then after the project has delivered its results and it is performance certified. And that's when the carbon reductions are verified and carbon credits are issued. So it's really it's actually quite a thorough process, and it's a really complex one, which I think in some cases leads people to get, the complexity feels opaque, when actually the carbon credit certification process is one of the most transparent that you'll see in the climate space. There are monitoring reports and verification reports on all carbon registries that you can look at as the public. So yeah, that's a process in a nutshell.
To what extent were the guidelines set out at Paris in 2015?
Well, so in the voluntary carbon market, the Paris Agreement doesn't take a view. Okay. We're all hoping that Article 6 is sorted in Glasgow, which will define the future of the compliance with what was the UN system, the clean development mechanism. So really, to Maria's point, this has been innovation and voluntary action that has emerged in the absence of those government decisions.
Okay. Now, when we spoke before this conversation, you drew the clear distinction between offsetting schemes that focus on emissions reduction, often with co-benefits, including for vulnerable people in developing as opposed to developed economies, on the one hand, and offset schemes that focus on removal, which are probably better known to the public, like forestry schemes or afforestation or reforestation on the other. And if I can summarize, you came down on the side of the former. So I just want to quote something, and this is shameless cribbing from The Economist, but it may just show you how quickly things go out of date. This is from May last year. And you know the way The Economist sort of mix up editorializing and reporting. If the world is to achieve net zero emissions, the only permissible offsets will need to be genuine negative emissions rather than schemes that simply reduce emissions. Am I right that they are arguing a directly opposite view to the one that you were articulating?
Well, I think they've got it generally wrong. That's correct. I think if we rush immediately to removals, we end up having to remove a lot more that we could have avoided. And that's not the scenario we want to find ourselves in. We do realize that carbon removals are going to be an important climate solution. And many of those are either to have long time frames in terms of biologic sequestration and afforestation, reforestation, as you mentioned, or they're very expensive in the case of technological removals, generally speaking. And so the way we look at it is that the priority right now should be on avoiding as much as we can so we don't have to remove later, but building that pipeline of projects longer term, both on the nature-based and the technological side.
Okay.
But yes, I respectfully disagree with The Economist.
Thank you, Sarah. And I do want to come back, give you a chance later to answer directly the view. Again, we saw it in the slides that overall offsetting is greenwash. But let me come first to Mike Giles, Head of Science, Policy and Research at Friends of the Earth. Very big job. Mike, thanks so much for joining us. Can you just start by stating Friends of the Earth collective position on offsetting broadly defined, given that it is central or it is an important part of most corporate net zero plans, and it's also in very sort of responsible grown-up pathways to net zero published by people like the IPCC, as far as I'm aware.
Thanks, Giles, and thanks for inviting me on. I think we'd all agree that offsetting is being used as greenwashing by some companies, probably a large number of companies. Just the other week, we stood shoulder to shoulder with Gold Standard, where there's a mine in Cumbria, a new coal mine planned, that says they're going to offset their operational emissions, and that means they should be allowed to go ahead and mine coal. And I think all of us on the call would say that is just out of out of order and unacceptable and shouldn't be a use of offsetting. Our problem with offsetting, I think we've got two main problems with offsetting. So one problem is, and it speaks to partly what Maria was talking about earlier, it's cheap as chips. And the reality is, at the moment, it's a disincentive for companies to invest in emissions reduction or invest in innovation and research so they can get rid of residual emissions. While offsetting is so cheap, finance managers in so many companies across the world will say, well, why do you want me? Why would I spend, £5,000 investing in this bit of kit to reduce my emissions when I spend, £500 to buy offsets and achieve the same goal? So it's a real disincentive. And I think, again, that's where we're with Maria, the carbon price, whether that's through the formal government mechanism or through an offset mechanism, needs to be much higher. So companies only ever think about it for those really residual emissions that just can't be got rid of. The second major problem we've got with it is around timescales, and this speaks a bit to what Sarah was talking about, I think, in that if you're releasing fossil fuel carbon dioxide through burning it, and then you're planting trees or restoring habitats, that restoration, that carbon capture in those habitats can't be guaranteed to last as long as the carbon pollution from burning fossil fuels will in the atmosphere. So carbon from burning from fossil fuels in the atmosphere will last for hundreds of years, thousands of years potentially. Whereas if you're locking it up in a tree or in a habitat restoration, you may be at best talking about holding on to that carbon for decades. So I guess in the real world, these things aren't fungible. They're not the same. They shouldn't be exchangeable. So that's a real problem with a large proportion of the offsetting world is about it saying we'll capture carbon in trees or habitat restoration, for example. So those are two of our big concerns with offsetting. And why we think, yes, the focus should be, as Maria says, should be much more on governments putting a real price on carbon and driving companies to do that emissions reduction, that innovation to make sure we're eliminating residual emissions as well.
Mike, thank you. Can I just come back to your first point, the cheap as chips point? Might there not be perfectly good, sound, market-based reasons why some offsets are cheap as chips, namely, for example, sort of low-hanging fruit, really significant carbon emissions reductions to be gained with relatively low levels of investment? I'm thinking wind power in India or solar in India, for example. And if so, shouldn't we be seizing those opportunities?
Yes, we should. I mean, we ought to be, we no longer have the luxury of any way of choosing. Do we reduce emissions from factory A, or do we help clean energy development in developing economies? The truth is we should be doing both of those things, not choosing, and offsetting itself as a premise is you're choosing to do A or B. Well, actually, of course, we need to do A and B. But also, at Frenzy Earth, we don't want to be completely black and white about this. And we live in too much of a binary world. Everything is good or everything is bad. Our argument, I think, is that for residual emissions only, and those residual emissions that really can't be eliminated in the near term, then there may be some offsetting projects out there that really do reduce emissions that wouldn't otherwise happen. But the scale of the market's growing, and the scale that people like Mark Carney and others are envisaging growing, we just don't think those projects are out there at that scale. So if it was really about only focusing on residual emissions, and people who are selling carbon offsets say, actually, we're not going to sell them to you unless you can prove to us that that is a residual emission, then we're going to have that problem of massive amounts of greenwash.
Okay, thanks, Mike. That's a very specific point that Mike just made, and I want to invite Sarah and or Maria to come back at that. He said, we don't think the projects are out there at sufficient scale. You're both kind of at the coalface, as it were. What do you think about whether there are enough good quality certifiable projects out there to meet the demand at the moment? Why don't you go first, Maria, and then I will come to Sarah.
So can we just say green face rather than the cool face? But
sure.
Just in terms of absolutely right now, the demand far outweighs the supply, but that's good in terms of carbon credit prices going up. It really puts a business case for much more ambitious projects that are high-hanging fruits. And so here's the thing. So a lot of times what you were showing with Mark Carney, that wasn't what the scale of the voluntary carbon market has to grow in, that's the scale of how much decarbonization has to come. So if you actually read the fine print to that, that is just how much carbon reductions have to occur. And he's assuming it will come under some kind of carbon price. So that's, if you were to think of it that way, that can either be companies reducing their own emissions through decarbonization, or it can go towards projects, so offset projects. And so what the key thing here is to then look at, regardless, there are emissions being released. What are the high-hanging fruits that would actually demonstrate large volumes of reductions, or very key things in different parts? So that could be things like forest conservation. We are losing our forests. It's not even a joke if the IPCC's latest report says the southern Amazonian forest is now a source of emissions, not a sink. So what are the interventions then can stop them from occurring, and how do we finance that? On the other side, it could be, things that we're looking at in terms of large, just even something as simple as cook stoves, or smart grids. So the next thing is microgrids that allow for communities to have renewable energy. The infrastructure for that is more expensive to enable. How could that be much more compelling? How can you switch now from vehicles in places where kerosene is subsidized, or fossil fuels are subsidized? How does the electric vehicle switch, and how do we make sure that the power sources for that itself are also low carbon? So it's much more exciting because you can go from old projects to much more new and transformative projects with a higher carbon price. There's a little lag effect because you have to develop the methodologies that can truly show that this is creating impact. I'll let Sarah go on to that, but those are some of the things that make it a lot more exciting with a much more stronger price, due to demand being greater than supply.
Okay, thanks. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, is there enough high quality supply? The answer is it's hard to answer definitively. Gold standard, our name suggests what position we like to, we aim to occupy in the market. It is, one of the things to consider is that the market evolves also. And so you have to, we take decisions like looking at our renewable energy portfolio and saying, okay, in many markets now, renewable energy has sufficient, feed-in tariffs, or, is economically viable. So we make decisions to change our rules and make those tighter over time to reflect those evolving market conditions. So it is a bit of a moving target, and you have to evolve with how different technologies are coming to fruition in different places. But yes, there is, we need a lot more investment to make the higher hanging fruit possible. And this goes back to the carbon price. Those carbon removal technologies that'll have to scale over time will need a lot of investment. So we want to send, it's, as Maria mentioned, it's great that demand is increasing, which can unlock financing for the higher hanging fruit moving forward.
And I did want to invite you to respond to the greenwashing charge, because I found your response to that quite compelling.
Yeah, well, I teased it in the chat here, because there's the whole kind of trope about is carbon offsetting a license to pollute. When I ask the same question, like, is it a license to just not care about waste because you pay a fee for someone else to manage your rubbish and your recycling? Obviously the first priority must be on reducing. And I agree with Mike wholeheartedly that we should be limiting offsetting to what's truly unabatable rather. So I just find it to be, and maybe to respond a bit to Mike's point about offsets being cheap as chips, what's even cheaper is doing nothing at all. So I think that, or, allowing and encouraging all companies to take responsibility for their residual emissions, not instead of, but in addition to reducing in line with what science says is needed to stay within 1.5 degrees, is absolutely best practice, and companies should be applauded for doing that. So I find it almost bemusing, to be honest, I'll say it. I agree with Mike also that it is used to greenwash in the fossil fuel, oil and gas sector. And if you're doing nothing at all to reduce your footprint, I would say that claim could also stand. But the instrument writ large does not mean that it's, carbon offsetting is a permission to pollute. You're actually fining yourself for your emissions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I wondered, John Hawksley, I don't know if you're there. I think you're alluding to an important point in the would not otherwise happen remark that you've made in the chat, but I'm not sure. Would you care to just expand for a second before we move on? John, are you there? Perhaps not. Okay. It's so wonderful, these messages. I never know quite who they're coming from, but he's no longer with us. Mike, I want to come back to you briefly, actually with a specific question about aviation. Now, aviation is the sector that is most often accused of inverting the whole net zero goal and going first to offsetting, because frankly, it doesn't have an alternative at the moment, and then making promises to reduce its carbon footprint in due course. What do you make of that argument? And let's stipulate, as they say in American courtrooms, that the goal should be on both sides to reduce the carbon footprint of aviation. But given that we are where we are, and isn't it the smart and right thing to do for airlines right now to try and make offsetting A, large scale, and B, sort of provably doing what it says on the tin?
So you're right, Charles. Aviation is a really interesting sector to look at, isn't it? Because at the moment there are no clear alternatives ready at hand for powering aviation at a large scale. Battery technology is moving on. We're not going to have battery planes that can carry 100 people for many decades, and there is more investment into sustainable aviation fuels, but at the moment they're incredibly expensive in its beginning part of a technology. Of course, the aviation industry, which has been incredibly reluctant to talk about climate change for many years through the international regime, is now saying we're going to embrace offsetting, and yet has been roundly condemned for the standard of offsets they say they want to incorporate, the integrity of those offsets. And so whilst I think it's great to have Sarah from Gold Standard on here, because I think Gold Standard go much further than many others to try and make sure that the projects that they sell, the offsets they sell, are really high in integrity. And Maria, your company may do the same. I don't know them. But there are a lot of offset players in the market. It's an unregulated market who are putting very poor quality offsets there that aren't additional, that won't be permanent, that actually don't even match up on a ton of carbon to carbon basis. And those are the sorts of ones that the aviation industry is also embracing and basically sending a message: carry on flying, it's all right. So they're not really even dealing with residual emissions. Well, the aviation industry, I think, has got to get real and say, we recognise that we need to see demand management. We need to embrace taxes on aviation fuel, for example, the carbon pricing kind of message that Maria said. We recognise that aviation is too cheap and too many people are taking too many flights that aren't necessary. We're going to have to increase the price of aviation. We're going to have to constrain airport expansion. We're going to have to, as well as invest in terms of efficiency, recognise that actually in the future we're going to have to use these sustainable aviation fuels, even if they are much more expensive. But the industry isn't doing that. It isn't doing that. It's selling a good line, but largely it's embracing offsetting and saying, carry on flying, all's okay, don't need to worry about it. And all of us know that's not the case. So, you know, I'd put them in the same bucket as those fossil fuel industries that's saying they want to carry on business as usual, but using offsetting as a way of trying to greenwash that. And they're not in the same bucket, I think, as many businesses who are doing their best and are trying to go that extra mile and are really using offsetting just for residual emissions. And those are two very different camps, I think.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, they are saying that they will use sustainable aviation fuel at scale in due course, but they're relying heavily on economies of scale to make them affordable, aren't they? And I take your point, though, that absent really dramatic economies of scale, the price of fueling a jet will go up and up. While we're on aviation, I'm sorry, I just want to drill down a little bit. Mike, or anybody else, has anybody done proper due diligence on this CORSIA, CORSIA scheme, to which a lot of big airlines, including IHG, the owner of BA, attach a great deal of significance? It's been a long time coming. It'll finally be in action as of this year or early next, I think. Is it a step change in responsibility, to use the word of the day? Sarah, I see you shaking your head.
No, I mean, there are multiple issues with this being a transformational change. One is that, back to Mike's concern on quality, there are many credits that are allowed under CORSIA that we would say ought not to be, including the UN CDM credit system. The other is that the IATA body lobbied for to water down the requirements. So they took advantage of the pandemic to lower the baseline. So because the requirement is only to offset any growth from a baseline year, and factoring in COVID levels of travel mean that the near future will lead to very little demand on the CORSIA side. It is a mechanism that should exist because international aviation lies outside of the Paris Agreement parties, but it ought to be much stricter, much tighter than it is.
Really interesting to know. Thank you. I do want to go to John now, just because, apart from anything, his garden looks so beautiful, and we can get a look at the blue sky and that tree behind you before the leaves disappear. John, can you explain what you were saying in the chat about would not otherwise happen? Because, as I said, I think this alludes to an important aspect of offsetting.
The idea of creating carbon in one part of the world in order to finance wind farms in India is bizarre. India needs to promote its own wind farms. I was the managing director of an independent oil company in the North Sea. It was a one-product company. It couldn't be zero carbon. It had to be priced out of business. For us to have planted trees somewhere else to justify producing oil makes no sense at all. So it's far better to tax carbon and have the funds of tax revenues to give the support to projects for renewable energy and elsewhere around the world than it is, to give life to these companies.
So as a former managing director of an oil company, your view sort of more broadly of the sector as a whole is it should be taxed out of existence? And let me be clear, are you saying that you were taxed out of existence?
No, we ran out of oil, but
okay.
No, but the fossil fuel industry should be taxed out of existence. It should be priced. It should have started 20 years ago. Then we would have more renewables. We wouldn't have the gas crisis today. People would be accustomed to higher energy prices, and the technology would have developed far faster. I mean, there is technology in the pipeline. Solar energy, the big issue is storing energy more than producing it.
This is
but
fascinating.
The greenwashing of BP is pointless.
I'm sorry, I say that again.
The greenwashing by BP is pointless.
Okay, I was going to ask about
devote
that.
its energy to reducing, minimizing its own emissions in producing oil, and be prepared for oil to not be wanted.
John, if you were in Bernard Looney's position running BP now, do you think it would be realistic to try to do an Ørsted and become a fully renewable energy company? Or would you be preparing for something more akin to a Kodak?
Right now is a big question there, because that's with all the pressures from the financial community and everybody else. I couldn't answer.
Certainly a difficult challenge. Isabel is asking in the chat how you arranged the sunshine. I wonder where you are, John.
I'm in France.
Lucky you. Terrific. Maria, can I come back to you, because one of the points John made very clearly there was that expressed the view that the oil industry should be taxed out of existence. And you kind of started with the point that the emphasis of the whole conversation should be on governments finding ways to raise the effective price of carbon. Can you just tell the story of how the UK actually did this? One of the great unheralded stories, it seems to me, in carbon emissions reduction.
Yeah, it's my favorite story. Whenever I ask people, and I've already given you the answer, but which country managed to decarbonize its power sector the fastest and in 4 years, literally having the carbon intensity, most people will go to a Scandinavian country or Germany because there was so much investment in renewables. And that's incredibly important. We do need to subsidize low carbon solutions so that it can come to scale, so that it can compete with more expensive. But if you were to increase your renewable energy capacity, but still run coal power plants, you're not reducing emissions from your power sector. And what the UK did was, the UK in 2008 had set a long-term the Climate Change Act, which is a long-term target to reduce their emissions. At that time, it was 80% by 2050. Now it's net zero by 2050. And their key thing was to set interim reduction targets. And in the year, what happened was, normally power sector emissions were covered when the UK was part of the EU by the emissions trading scheme and the carbon price that was set from that market. But what happened was, because of the economic recession, it was way too low, around €5 per ton, which when the UK was looking at this, it wasn't going to be strong enough for the UK to meet its interim target. And so the UK, and interestingly, this was a conservative government, which actually said, okay, we put something called the carbon price support. It creates a top-up tax to whatever the EU price was at the time. And so essentially it went from €5 a ton to €27 a ton. And that, or 27 pounds per ton, sorry. And that was essentially enough to make the switch from coal to gas. And that meant that, and in fact, more so, like also renewables and to nuclear. So I actually have the figures here. So UK carbon intensity halved by 4 years, with coal reducing from 40% to 9%. And there was 45% of electricity coming from low carbon, 25% from renewables and 20% from nuclear. But that was an important switch. And that's a really important case to show how carbon pricing can push the dirtiest thing off the system. But what you need is actually a much more comprehensive government plan, so that when the carbon price increases, if you don't have something that can then push gas off the system, then that becomes problematic. But now that renewables, and we have seen that with the UK government with setting a payment scheme that essentially now has brought down the prices, we're seeing much more lower prices for onshore and offshore wind, then you can see that there is scope for low carbon sources that are cost effective to replace gas. And that is the kind of decarbonization that you need to see, a comprehensive approach, not just with carbon pricing, but with other types of policies that truly show a government is trying to move towards. I'm not saying the UK does everything perfectly, but in 4 years, managing to halve your carbon intensity by pushing coal off the system, that's a very powerful story. And by 2022 or 2025, the idea is to be coal-free.
Thanks, Maria. We've got time, I think, for one more technical question, which is posed by Tom in the chat. And then I want to come back to all three of our invited speakers just with a kind of a wrap-up question before we run out of time. Incidentally, this is going to be the last session of the day. I'm asked to sum up the whole summit. I won't really attempt to do that, but it is going to impose a slight time penalty on this session. So, Tom, do you want to stand up and ask your question, as it were?
Yeah, sorry, me again. Hi, I'm in a slightly different location than I was before. I was asking about insets. I've started hearing about carbon insets as opposed to offsets, which I understand to be more about dealing with your own carbon waste yourself or something. So I was wondering whether what the panel think of insets and if I've understood them correctly.
Sarah, yeah.
Okay. Apologies for the unmute. So in a word, insetting doesn't really exist. The idea is indeed to look within the supply chain to reduce emissions, but technically that would be part of your scope 3 or your value chain emissions. So any reductions there would be just reported to the GHG protocol, reported as part of your footprint. But one of the, I think what a lot of companies are starting to look at is looking for carbon offsetting that either resonates with their values because of the additional sustainable development benefits they deliver, or geographically, they might benefit some of their stakeholders in various geographies in a supporting way, even though it doesn't hit their carbon inventory. And some of those lines are actually quite blurry. So companies, they don't always know where their sourcing areas are, where all of their supply is coming from. And that's actually a program Gold Standard is working on now called Value Change, that's allowing companies to make those direct investments in their supply chains to the benefit of those stakeholders, often smallholder farmers in the case of apparel or food and beverage. So yeah, technically insetting is more, people think of it as proximity to, but really if you're talking about something that's in your supply chain, it's a reduction.
Thank you. Now, my question to all three of you, and Sarah, since we're with you, I'd like to start with you, is at the risk of oversimplifying, I think we probably have agreed on what would be the ideal scenario for the sort of role that offsetting would end up playing in a planetary shift to carbon neutrality. And it would be not as a first resort, but as a third resort. It would be sort of bound by regulations so that those doing the offsetting were doing it to comply rather than on a voluntary basis. It would be on a much larger scale with a much higher carbon price. That perhaps is a summary of what would be ideal, but I repeat, we are where we are. Given that we are where we are, do you think that is actually going to transpire in the time that the planet has left, over the next 10 years?
I don't think it will transpire without regulation to the extent it needs to and the timeframes required. I think that we as consumers, as investors, need to hold all of our companies, our asset managers to account to say, you need to be on a net zero trajectory and you ought to be taking responsibility for your residual emissions. Those are truly unabatable along that path to decarbonization. So I think in the absence of that regulation, that's what we all, again, as consumers and investors, ought to be doing to accelerate that without the top-down instruments.
Just want to make sure I heard the beginning of that correctly. You think that it won't happen without regulation, ergo, businesses need to be required by law to be on a net zero trajectory?
I would hope that businesses would be required by law to do so. I'm skeptical that will happen, but maybe optimistic. I mean, that would be terrific. Yeah. So in the absence of the requirement by law, I think we as individuals and investors can demand that and support those businesses that are doing that voluntarily.
Right. Of course, it opens up a whole can of worms about how a government would, in practice, determine the difference between a genuine and a fake net zero trajectory. But I take your point. Maria, can I come to you next? Comment, if you like, on my summary if it was not right. But how likely is it that the ideal becomes real?
So actually, we have seen an increase in carbon pricing schemes, but there is huge political economy effects. Like we saw what happened in France in 2018 when both carbon and energy prices went up, and the kind of backlash. So there really has to be a societal movement towards understanding carbon pricing, but also designing it such a way that it has proper distribution, but really pushes for decarbonization. That's on a citizen level, but beyond that, it's exactly what Sarah said in terms of we're seeing mechanisms, and this is interestingly enough through central banks and the push for Mark Carney in a different way on the task force on companies and financial institutions disclosing their climate risk. And that can have a lot of percolating effects. What I would say though and this kind of goes to what Kim has said, or asked in the chat, but really, if you want to see if a company is greenwashing or not, ask about their reduction plan. Show me your reduction plan. Get savvy on what kinds of things a company can be doing in their sector to reduce. And it helps having third-party reporting standards like the Science Based Target Initiative, who will be on October 28th setting out their net zero standard. That provides you with experts who are looking at this and really trying to support sectors in their reduction towards a target that's aligned to science so it gets to net zero. So you do need, unfortunately, this is happening in the voluntary space. It would be great if the government stepped forward and said, if you're going to claim a net zero target, this is what I expect, and I expect to be third-party validated. That provides the kind of credibility on what a net zero claim is, and it goes towards the summary that you provided. It's aligned to science, it is a clear reduction plan, and then what you're financing is what you could not avoid.
Okay. Thank you. Mike, you've expressed your broad skepticism over offsetting, but again, with your sort of pragmatist realist hat on, what do you think, what is the role that offsetting is going to sort of settle into over the next 5 or 10 years? What do you think is actually going to happen?
I think it's going to be a messy situation. These things already are. I think it's great hearing Maria and Sarah both saying, actually coming from this market, we think carbon pricing is the first route forward. I wish there were more carbon companies out there saying that. Obviously, carbon pricing isn't a silver bullet, and some sectors' regulatory approach is much more useful rather than the carbon pricing one. And Maria spoke to the challenges if you just use a carbon pricing signal, then you can create a backlash from the public. But I think I'd like to see offsetting companies doing almost as Maria said, saying, actually, we're not going to sell you an offset. Show us your reduction plan and we'll decide whether we'll sell you an offset. Because if you've got a genuine reduction plan, and these are genuinely your residual emissions, we will sell you a high quality offset. My fear is that those people who are really trying to be at the front of integrity when it comes to carbon offsets are just undercut by a vast swathe of others who are just trying to sell offsets as cheap as possible. And my fear is that governments won't regulate that properly. Until that happens, I think the messages from Friends of the Earth and others will be, say, first, you've got to cut your emissions. We're not going to be as nuanced as I would like us to be in many ways, because it's a black and white communications war out there, which will frustrate Sarah and others. But we need that regulatory approach to make sure that we don't have all those players in the market who are selling really dodgy offsets and allowing people to use fossil fuels way more than they should be able to.
By the way, are there any companies putting that sort of screening mechanism in the way of their own business, saying, show me your reduction plan and then I'll sell you an offset? I'm
not aware of any, but Sarah and Maria may know of ones, their own companies maybe looking at doing that. Obviously, well, this fight I talked about by the Cumberland coal mine, you know, Gold Standard were as equally aghast at what they were planning, but at the moment don't have a mechanism to say you can't buy our offsets. And I think that needs to change. I think it needs to be easier for offset companies to say, no, actually, we're not selling to you. We'll sell to folk instead.
Sarah, do you ever require that of your clients?
We actually, I mean, our job as a standard is to set the rules and requirements that are certified against. We don't have any control over the purchase and, you know, the selling of those credits. So we look to organizations like South Pole, like others who are advising companies to ensure that their clients are prioritizing reductions first. Okay.
Well, look, thank you all very much. It's such a fascinating subject. And sometimes it feels as if they're two parallel realities. The one offered by British Airways, for example, when you go and buy a ticket and are invited to tick a box and feel good about your flight to LA. And the other one, listening to those who are pointing out the flaws in the system, but also trying to fix the flaws in the system. And we've had both of them with us today, and Maria explaining the essential context going forward, namely more regulation, compliance rather than voluntary system, and above all, policies that contrive to raise the price of carbon. And I was really struck when you first told that story, Maria, how important it was that the legislative framework in the UK was irreversible in a sense, that you couldn't have a new government come in 2010, for example, and turn the whole thing over. Now that might, I don't know, it's a subject for another day, whether that was an accident of politics that Cameron happened to arrive with with a coalition, and B, having been to Svalbard and hugging huskies and pinning his colours to an environmental mast as a way of reinventing conservatism. Conversation for another day. It is 2 minutes to 1. It falls to me, obviously, to thank everyone who's joined us, Mike, Maria, and Sarah, and everyone else in the chat for this session, but also for all the sessions. It's been completely intense and frantic ever since we started with Paul Polman this morning, and his plea, which actually, coming full circle, Bilal refers to, well, you're saying it's noticeable, Bill, that Paul didn't really push the case for regulation. He did, however, push the case for what he calls net positive as a sort of sacred duty of big businesses now. We then heard from our response R100 team about the 6th update of the index, the extent to which big companies based in this country are fulfilling those responsibilities. Some are, some aren't. The headline, as you'll see from our website, is that too many seem to be hiding behind COVID as an excuse to do the easy thing. We'll continue to report on storylines that emerge from the data of specific interest to me, those ones that relate to climate, over the next week. We've heard in Luke's session about the whole concept, which I admit was new to me, of this slavery intensity, one's personal slavery intensity. I think we can all share the desire not to be personally responsible for 40 people working in conditions of modern slavery just by living a first world life. How do we fix that? And before that, we had a fascinating session hosted by Matt about mental health as an emerging priority, not just for employees themselves, but also for the health of a workplace and for the long-term viability of the businesses whose performance we measure in the Responsibility 100 Index. It's now 1 o'clock. Thank you again on behalf of all my fellow editors, and particularly on behalf of the incredibly hardworking and brilliant team who, Kim, I'm seeing you at the top there, Alexandra, Luke, Patricia, and everybody else who works on the data for Tortoise. I'll just say one more thing. I referred to it very briefly earlier on. Original reporting in the current news business is rare. Most of us scrabble around feeding off each other. But I think it's brilliant that at Tortoise, whatever else we do, we've got this team of elves, and I mean that in a good way, digging away at really important data that affects us all every day, that is easily manipulated and is often very difficult to present, but we do our best, and we, I think, get better and better with every iteration of all the indices we work on. So with that bit of Tortoise boosterism, I'm going to say thank you one more time, and have a great afternoon. Goodbye.